So today I'm hosting a panel with streamer Destiny, which most people have heard of, and former UK Minister for the Middle East, Ivan Lewis, to talk about the war in Israel. So I'm going to ask some questions that might be unpopular questions, but they're really important questions to ask. And just a quick note, Destiny is live streaming this discussion and will be available on our YouTube channel afterwards. So since Israel has retaliated against Hamas's vicious attacks on October the 7th, the Gazan Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas, but the Gazan Health Ministry has reported almost 20,000 civilian deaths in Gaza. This is a question that many people ask. It's a question that is quite unpopular, but it's an important question to ask. Do you think there's a particular number? Destiny, we'll start with you, but do you think there should be a limit of how many civilian deaths there should be? Or do you think it doesn't really make a difference as long as Hamas is killed and Hamas is gone?
That's kind of it's a challenging question. I think the obvious answer is yes. There's going to be an overall cap on the acceptable amount of civilian casualties. I think the difficult question is, one, is what should that cap be? And then two, should that cap be a strict number that emotionally we feel okay with, or should it be like a percentage of people killed that are civilians versus Hamas operatives? It kind of feels to me like emotionally, I think the whole world is stuck on this idea of like 20, 30, 40,000 deaths. I can't imagine it getting over 50,000 like civilian casualties and Israel having any international support for what they're doing. But it seems like people are more fixated on kind of just the number of casualties versus how many are what Israel would consider militants versus just civilians. But I think regardless of what that number should be, like even if 50% of the deaths were Hamas militants, I think the world is probably going to try to keep Israel pretty down on that number as much as possible. Like you've seen, even now Biden in private speeches is saying that Israel is quickly losing support if they continue to, I guess, just have as many deaths as there have been so far.
I guess the question is really how many. The big question is how many civilian deaths would you count as really too much? And also, Israel really hasn't released the proportion of how many civilian deaths there's been versus how many terrorists, so we don't actually know.
Mm-hmm. I mean, for how many, like I would say that there should be some proportionality between the number of militants killed and the number of civilians killed. And as long as Israel's conducting their military strikes with those numbers in mind, it's hard to say without like having access to their rationale for the targets they pick. But I mean, I would say from a strategic point of view, the ratio is what matters, right? That anytime you're striking into an area like this, especially where Hamas operates, there's always going to be some number of civilian casualties and some number of militant casualties. If that ratio is like 95% civilians, then, even 10,000 seems unbearably high. But if that ratio was like, anywhere from 50 to 60 to 70% militants versus civilians, then higher numbers become justifiable. But then you have to keep in mind, what is the world appetite for death in the Gaza Strip? And at that, even if it was 80% militants, if the number reaches like 100,000 dead, I don't know if the world would be able to bear it. I think at that point, you'd see immense pressure on the U.S. and people supporting Israel for military action. That's my feeling.
Ivan, what do you think?
Well, I think we need to go back to the beginning. I mean, Hamas targeted innocent civilians on October the 7th. They massacred people who had absolutely nothing to do with any military role whatsoever. Israel has targeted Hamas terrorists throughout the war. And the figures that are provided by the Gaza Ministry for Health, as you quite rightly said, they were controlled by Hamas, cannot be regarded as credible, legitimate figures. So the question really is the evidence that Israel is doing absolutely everything conceivably possible to avoid injuring or killing civilians? And I think there is very strong evidence that that's the case. They issue with people with warnings in advance. They tell populations where to move to avoid airstrikes, etc. This has hardly ever happened in previous military conflicts. When you look at conflicts that the US has been involved in, the United Kingdom's been involved in, Europe, unfortunately, in war, horrible things happen. That's the nature of war. And we have been responsible, not deliberately, but for the loss of many civilian lives in conflicts we have fought through decades. The question really is, are Israel doing everything conceivably possible to avoid the loss of civilian life? I believe that they are. Is one civilian death one too many? Absolutely. And do you want to see everything possible done to minimize the loss of innocent life? Absolutely. Equally, though, is it honorable or honest to say that in war, innocent people don't die? It would be completely dishonest. I'm afraid to say in war situations, mistakes are made. Things happen that shouldn't happen. And we also know that Hamas pride themselves in burying terrorists in the middle of civilian populations, in hospitals, in schools, in the middle of civilian populations. This whole myriad and network of tunnels that they have, they do it quite deliberately. So they have no regard for the loss of civilian life whatsoever. Quite the contrary. All they're interested in is the propaganda that they can deploy in saying that it's evidence of Israeli unacceptable behavior. So I think we have to put this in context. We have to look at the big picture. Of course, everything possible should be done to minimize the loss of civilian life. Is there any evidence that Israel aren't already doing that? I don't believe there is such evidence.
So just going back to the question, is there a limit of civilians? Or like Destiny gave he said it was proportionality, depends on how many militants versus civilians. Do you think there's any?
I think the proportion of people who die in this conflict, clearly, the overwhelming proportion in terms of Israeli self-defense has to be terrorists. There's no question about that. And I think all the evidence is based on legitimate statistics, not based on Hamas, Gaza Health Ministry statistics, is the vast majority of people who have lost their life on the Palestinian side have been Hamas terrorists, not ordinary civilians.
Who said that? There's no, who said that?
I think the evidence that I have seen is very much along those lines. The only statistics that you are quoting are statistics provided by the Gaza Ministry for Health. The Gaza Ministry of Health is not the National Health Service, with all due respect, Ellie. It's or Medicare. It's Hamas.
Yeah.
Can I say? Oh, sorry. Go
Sure.
ahead.
Yeah.
I was just say a quick thing on that. So I'm not a fan of the obviously of Hamas reporting their numbers or anything, but my understanding is that for the numbers that Hamas does report, that the Gaza Health Ministry does report, the numbers tend to be fairly accurate. They just don't ever release the status of whether a person killed was a militant or not. I don't know if there have been like official numbers yet, but I thought I'd heard an Israeli spokesperson say that it was probably around 5,000 terrorists had been killed, or terrorist militants, Hamas fighters, whatever you want to call them, have been killed so far. So about one terrorist for every, I guess, maybe 3 civilians killed, approximately, if the numbers are still around 20,000. I just think I understand I'm sympathetic towards fighting against Hamas, and I'm very sympathetic towards removing them. But unfortunately, the nature of using human shields, I think there's going to be a number that I think even the staunchest Zionist or Israel defender has to be uncomfortable with. Like if it ends up being that we can remove Hamas completely, but it's going to cost 500,000 lives to kill 50,000 terrorists, that's probably too much. Even from a moral point of view, ignoring like the world optics, I don't know if that's a appropriate number of civilian casualties to remove Hamas from leadership, I think.
Yes, I mean, yeah, like Destiny said, I know you're questioning really Hamas, what the numbers that they've released, which Hamas, it's the Gaza Health Ministry, but it's Hamas. They have like backed up proof, and they do generally give quite accurate statistics on this.
Sorry, I don't believe that you can be saying that we trust the accuracy and integrity of Hamas provided statistics. I mean, I can't accept that at all. What I think Destiny's saying is that the ratio of people who unfortunately are killed, there needs to be a very high ratio of those people who are terrorists rather than civilians. I think he and I agree on that. And of course, there reaches a threshold where any human being would have extreme concern if that threshold was crossed. But I do not believe currently that is the situation, because what they want you to believe is that we are currently in that place where there are a disproportionate number of civilians being killed in relation to terrorists, and that means there should be an immediate ceasefire. The only people who benefit from an immediate ceasefire are Hamas, because they continue to be in control of Gaza. There can be no way at the end of this war that Hamas continue to control Gaza. That cannot be in any way the outcome of this war. And let's be clear, they chose this war. They started this war. They started it by targeting innocent civilians, the biggest butchery of Jews in any single day since the Holocaust. They chose this war. They provoked this war. And they do use civilians as human shields. But the real question, Ellie, is, do we believe the integrity of the Israeli government? Forget the politics. The Israeli government, when it says that we are doing everything we conceivably can do to avoid civilian casualties. And I believe they genuinely are doing everything they can. But does that mean there won't be civilian casualties? It doesn't mean that, because Hamas use people as human shields, and because in war, terrible things happen and mistakes are made.
Okay, brilliant. Moving on to the next question. So, what happens after the war is finished and Hamas is gone? So, there's 2 points to this question. Number one, who takes control of Gaza? I mean, Bibi Netanyahu said the other day that he thinks Israel should temporarily take over Gaza, and of course, a lot of people got really upset at that. So, that's the first question: who should take control from Gaza? And number two, as many people are talking about this, a lot of people have been see a lot of their family being blown up, and they get radicalized. They're going to get radicalized by that. So how do we combat that in the future? So two-part question.
For who takes control of Gaza, that's a really hard one. Giving it back to Abbas, I know Netanyahu has been staunchly opposed to that. He's been opposed this entire time to the idea of basically clearing Hamas out of Gaza, destroying as much as he can, and then handing that piece of land basically back to Abbas, who he would argue has already been an ineffective leader. And Israeli occupation of Gaza seems like a step back, considering the unilateral disengagement from 2005, to go back to having an actual military occupation, regardless of whether or not you think the current blockade and everything amounts to an occupation, is also difficult. I don't think the worst thing in the world would be some sort of temporary Israeli occupation until everything is back okay again, and then elections are held, possibly, and then another disengagement happens from the military. I also don't necessarily think it's bad to give it back to Abbas, as much as Netanyahu doesn't want to do that. I think that obviously the temperature needs to be turned down significantly in regards to these two regions, the Gaza Strip and Israel's attitudes towards each other. But understandably, after October 7th, I'm sure that Israel's not too keen to set the temperature down on that. Also, I don't know what happens if you have an occupation, you hold elections again, and then another militant group is elected, the Gaza Strip. It seems like you're kind of back to square one. So I feel like my inkling turns towards giving it back essentially to the PA, I guess, as much as I don't think Netanyahu is a big fan of that. I think that's kind of the only reasonable option for it to happen.
I mean, I guess what is temporary? That's a big question, because you see temporary and then it could last forever. And then, like you said, the big question is as well, the Palestinian Authority giving it back to them. What happens if another militant group takes over?
I think at some point you have to be willing to stop with the what ifs and kind of make a decision and then kind of move forward. I think that Israel operates under the same kind of foreign policy assumptions that existed for the country in 48 and 67 and 73, and that's that if they make the wrong move, their country is going to be destroyed. Israel faces obviously a horrible threat to its civilian population, but they don't have any existential crises anymore. The country's not going to be destroyed or eliminated. That should be off the table, and it has been off the table for some 30, 40 years now. I think that the important thing is to kind of treat the Palestinian Authority as like a neighbor that you're going to have regardless of anything that happens, and then try to slowly continue to hand over power to them, and then hopefully work towards some sort of mediated solution between the Palestinians and the Israelis that would hopefully bring an end to this conflict, as dumb as that sounds, because it's been going on for so long, and it seems like we've never been able to get to that peace process. But yeah.
What do you think?
Well, Destiny's right. It's very complicated. The truth is, though, that the threat that Israel faces is not simply the threat that we've seen over the last couple of months. You have Hezbollah in the north. You have Iran controlling Hezbollah and also controlling Hamas, as we know. You have Syria, where, frankly, it's an ungoverned state, where you have terrorism running rife there, again, with a significant level of Iranian control. You have an Iranian state that are committed to wiping Israel off the face of the earth and are committed also to developing a nuclear weapon. So to say that Israel doesn't face extremely serious threats, it might be, by the way, the threat of Iran is not just about Israel. It's about a threat to the stability of the Middle East and indeed the world. And unless the world gets real and serious about that Iranian threat post this conflict, then I'm afraid we're heading for very, very difficult territory. It was only a few days before Russia invaded Ukraine that President Biden was attempting to sign a further nuclear deal with Iran. Who was he using as his intermediary? Russia, to negotiate that deal. I mean, this kind of naivety on behalf of the West has got to come to an end. Iran poses, as I say, not just a threat to Israel's existence, it's a threat to the moderate Arab states' existence, it's a threat to the stability of the region, and therefore the world. So that's the context that we need to look at this situation in. In terms of governance, there are two separate issues. Who is going to be responsible for security in terms of Gaza once the war is over? And who is going to be responsible for rebuilding Gaza, its economy, its governance, jobs, hope, healthcare, education? Those are separate issues. And I would say that in the short term, it's inevitable Israel will have to take some degree of control over security.
What does short term mean?
That very much depends on what happens at the end of the war, what's happened to Hamas. And it also depends, frankly, on a dialogue with the moderate Arab states in the region in terms of what are they willing to do in terms of the contribution to the rebuilding and the
What about the governance?
And the governance of
and the governance as well.
the Palestinian Authority. So if you look at the situation with the PA, the problem is I've seen some pretty frightening polling in the last couple of days, which shows that Abbas has lost virtually total support amongst the Palestinians, both on the West Bank and Gaza. So whatever people feel about Fatah versus Hamas or the Palestinian Authority, as long as that Palestinian Authority is run by Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian people have no confidence in it whatsoever. That's just a fact.
I mean, actually,
poll after poll,
support for Hamas has actually gone up. In the
yeah,
West Bank,
poll after poll after poll illustrates this. So the challenge is, when we talk about the PA, who's going to be leading the PA? Who are going to be the people making the decisions? What kind of external support are they going to get? What is the role of the moderate Arab states, particularly the Abraham Accord Arab states, but also, frankly, Saudi Arabia? Let's be clear. Once this war is over, within 6 to 12 months, I believe that Saudi-Israeli normalization will take place. Now, it seems to me, as part of that private dialogue between Israel and Saudi, because it will be private to start with, because Saudi will not engage in public dialogue with Israel in the immediate aftermath of the war. It will take some time, okay? There has to be, obviously, hard discussions about governance. And if the Palestinian Authority was strong, if it was well led, if it had capacity, clearly it would be the appropriate entity to be responsible for governance and rebuilding Gaza. But none of those things are true, which makes this incredibly difficult and complicated. So, of course, it can't be, and it would be a total disaster, by the way, if the Israelis, in my opinion, will not want in any way to take responsibility for any of that, okay? They will want some control over security for obvious reasons after the 7th of October. But in terms of the rest of it, it's got to be a combination of, obviously, the PA has got to be involved in the dialogue, the Palestinian Authority, but also, it seems to me, the moderate Arab states and also and the international community. Yeah. Because the international community is going to be asked, by the way, to put a lot of money in to the rebuilding of Gaza.
Okay, I mean, going back, as well as I also asked a question just before, I mean, how is Israel going to combat all these people who have been radicalized? I mean, Destiny, what's your thoughts on that? How is Israel going to combat all these people who have been radicalized, that see their family being bombed or see all these atrocities happening?
In my opinion, I feel like the Palestinian cause for a number of decades has had legitimate support and legitimate grievances behind it since the inception of the State of Israel. And I think for a long time, the Palestinian people had nations with pan-Arab, kind of aspirations. You had Egypt, you had Jordan, you had Syria, all these countries that were kind of supporting their cause. And I think as the decades have rolled on and they've been unsuccessful in fighting for that cause, you've kind of seen these guys all drop off the map, except for kind of these more radical Islamic jihadist groups, or these more radical groups supported by Iran, right? I think the Palestinian cause went from having the support of Syria, Jordan, Israel, to having the support of Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran. And that's not good. And I feel like a key to figuring out, as naive or dumb as it may seem, I think a key to figuring out a lot of these issues is going to rest in the world's ability to somehow negotiate with Iran to kind of get them to chill on everything. Because I think it's going to be really hard to turn down the radicalization aspect of people in the Palestinian regions, as long as they have so much foreign support from what I would argue are essentially terrorist groups. In terms of like, what can Israel do in particular? I mean, I don't know what that campaign would look like. If you're talking about like going in and like doing like a de-propaganda campaign where you stop, like spreading certain propaganda in schools or whatever. I don't know if that's appropriate for Israel to even engage in. I don't know if they would even have the support, even the Middle East in engaging in that sort of thing. But I would hope that any step that Israel takes towards kind of normalizing relations, which again is going to be really hard after October 7th, or at least for the coming years, anything where you're normalizing relations with the Palestinians and kind of like easing up on all the restrictions, easing up on all the blockades, easing up on all of the, the settlements and everything, I would hope that that would move them towards a slightly warmer place in terms of being less radicalized. But I think that radicalization element, that has to be a part of the significant changing of the material conditions on the ground for those people. It can't just be speeches or unpropagandating people, I think.
Yeah, well, what's your thoughts?
Well, I think Destiny's right. At the end of the day, radicalization and hatred, the idea that this war has created that, it's already there.
Yeah.
And it was there before this war started in very, very strong, the strongest possible terms. Let's be clear about that. I disagree with Destiny when he talks about dialogue with Iran. I think the regime is a rogue regime. I don't think there's any way you can do business with this regime. I think we need to differentiate, however, between the Iranian people and the regime. And we also need to recognize that within the hierarchy in Iran, there are moderates who don't approve of the extremists and extremism of the regime. So we have to hope that from within Iran there comes change. But the idea of us having sort of nice dialogue with them will cause them to change their behavior, I just don't think is going to happen. I think Destiny's right. The idea, the strategy that's been pursued, which frankly has fallen apart, which is because there is no major pressure in Israel for a two-state solution anymore, you just leave the status quo as it is. In my opinion, is not on. And what that means is, I think that we have to be realistic. The prospect of two states has never been further away than it is today. So the idea that somehow in the next 6 months, 12 months, you hear Western politicians quoting two states, it isn't going to happen for the foreseeable future. It just isn't. Okay, that's the realpolitik. However, the rights of Palestinians to live with dignity, with hope, with jobs, with economic growth, with decent education, with the best possible healthcare, all of that should be absolutely non-negotiable, right? Yeah. Now, is it Israel's responsibility to make that happen? No. Is it Israel's responsibility, however, to be part of a process with the Arab world and the international community to ensure that that is what's happening on the ground? Absolutely. So simply to say there is no pressure on us as an Israeli government to do anything about the Palestinians anymore because Israeli public opinion is so turned against a two-state solution. So we simply sit there and do nothing, in my view, is irresponsible. And it's by the way, it completely unraveled on the 7th of October. The whole strategy towards the Palestinians unraveled. So yes, when this war is over, providing Hamas have been removed from control of Gaza, and that's a very, very important proviso, okay? There has to be a massive effort, Israel, the international community, the Arab world, to looking at how do they give the Palestinians the means to improve their own lives and improve their own standard of living, their own education, their own healthcare, to restore some level of hope. And what's quite interesting, you referred to the polls, Ellie, on the West Bank and Gaza. It's very interesting. The people least supportive of what Hamas are doing are the people who have been ruled tyrannically by Hamas, i.e. Palestinians in Gaza. So if you look at the polls of Palestinians on the West Bank and Palestinians in Gaza, in terms of attitude to what Hamas have done, both groups support what Hamas have done. Let me be clear about that. But the proportion of people who are dubious about Hamas and their motives in Gaza is far greater than the West Bank. Why is that? Because the people of Gaza have had to live under the tyrannical rule of Hamas since 2005, 2006. And we shouldn't forget that. When people talk about the dreadful conditions that have existed in Gaza over a long period of time, those conditions are not as a consequence of the behavior of the Israeli government. They're a consequence of the conduct of a terrorist organization which has been holding Gaza to ransom and trying to impose its extreme ideology on the ordinary Palestinians living there.
My thoughts on the point of radicalization, what happens is the people in Gaza right now, they don't have much hope. And the only possible point of hope that they do have is Hamas. Realistically for them, you're in Gaza, they're in Gaza and they look at, okay, if Hamas win this war, which of course isn't going to happen, Israel going to win this war. If Hamas wins this war, at least we have a future. That's what they're going to be thinking. Now, that isn't true. That's a lot of them are going to be thinking. So my personal thoughts on radicalization is really, I mean, you can care about making everything nice and giving them good education, but the main thing is really giving them something to hope for, and giving them something that they can aspire to, and giving them a possibility of a really good future. And it's just really that's what I say. Just moving on to the next question, really. So this is quite a big question. I mean, recently reports have came out saying that Israel and the IDF actually knew what was going to happen on October 7th, yet they didn't know about it. I mean, it's a really strange phenomenon, saying that one of the biggest, well, not the biggest, but one of the best armies in the world knew that this terrorist attack was going to happen, yet they didn't do anything about it. I mean, the other day I was in Israel and I sat down with a former Israeli general, Amos Gilad, who was very high up in the Israeli army, or in the IDF really, and he was part of the Ministry of Defense. He was in charge of policy there, and he told me that Israel made like a really big mistake about not stopping October the 7th. So, I mean, it's just crazy to think about all of this. So I guess the question really is, Destiny, I mean, I'll ask you this one, and then we'll go to Ivan. What's your thoughts on this? Do you think it was genuinely a huge mistake, or do you think they let it happen for any particular reason? Because that's a lot of people have been theorizing that.
So one of the things about intelligence is there's a lot you don't see. And I don't like to make strong declarations about whether or not something could have been stopped unless the intelligence prior to the attack indicated, one, with great precision what was going to happen, and then two, with a high degree of confidence. The issue with that, what I've seen, I know there was I think it was a CNN article I read about these attacks. They called it, I think they called it the Operation Jericho Wall or something, right? I think is what the Israeli side had codenamed these plans. My understanding that one, they didn't think it was possible for them to do what they claimed they were going to do. And then two, even when they were discussing these plans, I don't believe a particular date was attached. So it was essentially that like, yeah, here's a way that these fortifications could be overran. Here's a way that they could do the attack if they wanted to. But it's hard to say, like, unless there was a particular date attached and unless they really truly believe they had the means to do it. I haven't seen compelling evidence to show that Israel was like, yeah, we know this attack is coming, but we're just going to let it happen so that we can foment, hatred and adversarialness to the, Gaza Palestinians so we can go in and invade. Not to say that it's impossible, but I think there needs to be a pretty high threshold of evidence that has to be presented for us to believe that, the IDF or Netanyahu or the military apparatus in Israel knew that attack was coming, but they just decided, we're going to let some thousands of civilians die so that we can go in and invade because that would be awesome. That's a really insane proposition. I say insane. It's a grand proposition to let so many of your own countrymen die, and it demands a high level of evidence, I would say, to prove that.
So, I mean, I was in Israel the other day, and it seems actually quite accepted that in there that Bibi Netanyahu made a big mistake that you know about, and he didn't really stop it. It was his failures that caused this. And like I said, when I was talking to the former Israeli general, he said that the IDF made a big mistake. That it seemed like they did know something about it. Maybe, like you said, maybe they didn't know the exact dates, or maybe they didn't know everything about it. But it seems like they did push it away. Maybe they were a bit too arrogant.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've been in so many conspiratorial places on the internet. I might have misunderstood your question. Insofar as did Israel make a mistake? That seems to be obvious. Yes, for sure. And if they had details of a plan like this, then that would also obviously be, even without a particular date attached, they messed up and not being ready for something like this. I'm sorry. The way that I usually hear this claim presented is that Netanyahu intentionally ignored any of these things because he wanted the attack to happen so that it would give an excuse to launch military actions.
You didn't misrepresent my question. I was asking you, do you think that was a possibility?
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Yeah. It would be foolish to say that everything isn't a possibility, but to believe the grander conspiracy, that it was a conspiracy, that it was allowed to happen, that would require a high bar of evidence. In terms of was there a mistake, I mean, that seems obvious. It would be hard to believe there wasn't some sort of mistake made of this attack was able to happen as well as it had happened against the Israeli people. Yeah.
I mean, Ivan, you are the former UK Minister for the Middle East, so you know people in Israel very well, very high up there, and also the government very well. What's your thoughts on this?
Well, there'll be a commission of inquiry that will try and get to the bottom of this. What we know is that for 15 hours, marauding terrorists were allowed to butcher well over 1,000 Israelis, including 300 soldiers, rape women, do all sorts of horrendous things, 15 hours before any Israeli security response. That is absolutely extraordinary, unprecedented, inconceivable. And it's shaken the Israeli people and the Israeli security apparatus to the core.
Why do you think it took so long to react?
It's inexplicable. Do I think there was a conspiracy to enable this to happen, to enable people to be butchered? Of course not. I think that's a load of nonsense. People who peddle that sort of stuff. But do I think that there was a failure that is very, very difficult for us to understand? Absolutely. And you may never get to the bottom of it. You can have inquiry after inquiry. You may never get a satisfactory answer. Destiny's right. Of course, we don't always have access to intelligence, the full range of intelligence. What I am aware of is that the Israelis knew that a plan of an insurgency into Israel like this existed over a number of years. They knew it existed for a number of years, yeah, and they knew about it in some detail. But of course, over a number of years, nothing happened. So there is a risk that people become, I guess, complacent. And we also hear that on the eve of the actual attack on the 7th of October, the IDF were told that there was something brewing that was different, that wasn't run-of-the-mill, that wasn't routine, that wasn't usual. But we don't know. And this is what will have to be established by the Commission of Inquiry, which will inevitably come after this war. My own view is that the future of Israel will be hotly debated once this war is over. Its political leadership, its military leadership, its security leadership. All of that will be on the table. And the idea that it's more of the same, carry on as before, absolutely nonsense. This is a seismic moment in the history of the State of Israel. By the way, it's a seismic moment in terms of the history of the Jewish people as well. And that, in my view, will lead to a call, strong calls for radical change. What that radical change will be remains to be seen. And we know that before this terrible war, there was tremendous division amongst the Israeli population, horrendous division, religious, non-religious, left, right, anti-Bibi, pro-Bibi. And what's fortunate, the only good thing you could say about war is that it has united the Israeli people. And that's been, clear. And it's united, I think, large swathes of Jewish people around the world. So it has led to more unity. But the truth is that once the war's over, I think there will be a call for massive change, as I say, both political change.
What do you call by massive change? Do you mean like?
I think the whole. I don't think it's just about one man. I think the whole political system in Israel is broke. The whole political system, where you have this ridiculous purest form of proportional representation. Yeah. You have elections every 10 minutes. You don't have stable government. You have a situation where clearly one man has dominated Israeli politics now for decades politically. I suspect all of that is inevitably going to change. What we don't know is what will the Israeli people demand in place of what they've had before. That remains to be seen. But this has sent shockwaves. It has traumatized the Israeli people. Make no mistake about it. What happened on October the 7th and the ongoing effect of war on any country is absolutely horrendous. We shouldn't forget that there are still hostages that are in the hands of these horrendous, evil terrorists. That we must call. For the international community to do everything it can to have those hostages released. We know that, there are soldiers fighting in the most horrendous and difficult of circumstances. When you're fighting terrorist organizations, when there's a myriad of tunnels as there are in Gaza, it's not easy terrain for soldiers, however well trained. So that is the reality that people are facing now. But I do believe that the Israeli people will reflect on a broken system and will demand radical change once this war is over.
Brilliant. Destiny, do you have any final words?
Insofar as just like everything in general, Or about what? Say that.
What about the broken political system in Israel?
I'm familiar with like the international, or I guess the relationships between Israel and everybody else. I don't have as much of a commentary on the internal runnings of the Israeli political system. So no, I don't think I have strong opinions. I don't have strong opinions on if it should change or not. I'm not sure. I'm an American two-party guy. I don't like coalition governments. I don't like all the smaller parties having big says and everything. But I know other people don't like having only two parties. So yeah, I don't have a strong opinion on the organization of Israeli domestic policies. Yeah.
Well, brilliant. Thanks so much for coming on, Destiny. Thank you so much for having me.